Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now, today, I'm honoured to be speaking with Dr. Sian Beilock. Sian, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I'm delighted to have you on. Keen follower of your work. I think to get us started, why don't you introduce us to yourself, your work, to the Sports Psych Show audience?
Yeah, happy to. So I am a cognitive scientist by training, but I actually have two PhDs, one in kinesiology, the study of human movement, and one in cognitive psychology. And basically, I've spent my career as a researcher asking questions about why people choke under pressure in everything from golf to the boardroom to the classroom and what we can do to fix it. And in the last several years of my life, I've also gone from being a professor to an academic leader, and I'm now the president of Barnard College at Columbia University, which is the college focused on women's leadership associated with Columbia in New York City, and that's where I am right now.
Am I right in thinking, I'm just going to draw on your TED Talk, that were you a soccer player at high school?
Yeah.
Goalkeeper.
I played at a high level, yeah.
Okay, and it's goalkeeper is a massively psychological position, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, I always say I do a little bit of me-search in addition to research. Like, I wanted to know why I sometimes didn't perform at my best when it mattered most. And I realized when I was an undergraduate majoring in cognitive science, and even when I went on to graduate school, that people were asking lots of questions about how you get good at things, like what kind of practice leads to better performance. But there wasn't a lot of conversation or research asking questions about why, when you have skill and ability, you sometimes don't show it in those situations where you want to put your best foot forward. And so I started studying it.
And that very much resonates with me, because I always say to people, one of the reasons why, or probably the predominant reason why I'm a sports psychologist now, is I just was always asking, as a professional golfer, I was also always asking the question, why? Why do I feel like this? And it was often lacking belief. And why am I feeling so nervous? And I'm going to start slightly selfishly, if it's okay with you. And I'm going to draw on one of probably the most amazing experience I had as a golfer. And look, Sian, I was an okay golfer. I wasn't the best. I sort of played on the satellite tours, but I got into the 1998 final qualifier for the British Open. So a couple of rounds away from playing in arguably the biggest tournament in the world. And I got drawn with two very prominent golfers, and the weather was horrendous. It was 40 miles an hour wind, so that we could hardly stand up, which didn't help. And I was playing with two prominent players, and we had lots of people watching. And I was absolutely terrified. I was shaking on the first tee. Somehow, Sian, I managed to actually launch it down the middle of the fairway. Unfortunately, I took another 90 shots to complete my round, which just about everybody knows that shooting 91 as a professional golfer isn't a great place to be. So look, my first question, I was terrified, I was nervous, I was focused on playing partners, I was focused on the crowd. The club felt alien in my hands. What was happening there? You've written this book, the seminal book on this, Choke, What the Secrets of the Brain Reveal About Getting It Right When You Have to. What was I doing? What was going on?
Well, I think you hit on something really key, that it's not just our skill level that matters, right? It's how we feel and think in that moment. And, you're describing precisely a choking situation. And I describe choking as it's not just poor performance, and we all have ups and downs. What I'm really interested in is that poor performance in those situations where you feel stress and anxiety to perform at a high level, where there's something on the line, where you want to put your best foot forward, and counterintuitively you can't, right? I mean, you would think that when we want to be motivated and do something, we should be able to do it. And so a lot of what I focus on in my research is how our attention changes in those situations. So attention is really important, right? It's how we can do anything. And maybe it's not so obvious if you're not always focused and researching attention, but it's not always better to have more attention to what you're doing. Sometimes we do the best when we just let things go on autopilot, right? And even what you're describing so far, it sounds like you were so hyper aware of the situation that you were also hyper aware of what you were doing. which can actually disrupt your performance. And that's a lot of what I study. How do we get in the right frame of mind so in the stressful situation we can just roll off our best performance without a lot of effort and control.
More of a just do it type of principle.
Yeah, and it doesn't come from not caring or not paying attention to anything. It comes from paying attention to the right things, right? You were certainly focused on things, the crowd, your high-profile players playing with you. You were focused on lots of things. It just wasn't the right thing.
When my brain was focusing on the wrong thing, do we have much neuroscientific evidence there? Do we know what's happening in the brain as I'm standing there on the first tee and I'm hyper aware and or I'm focusing on things that possibly aren't going to help me?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, we haven't figured out how to have people play golf in a brain imaging machine. So the techniques that I use to study the brain and to peek inside the head is MRI, so magnetic resonance imaging, and a slight tweak on that, which is called functional MRI. And an MRI is just a big magnet, right? All it does is measure the magnetic properties of whatever's inside it, which in this case, we study the head. But people have had MRIs on, if you're an athlete, on your shoulder or on your knee, anything, right? Yeah. And because different types of body tissue and brain tissue have different magnetic properties, from the MRI, you can get a really nice picture of the structure, like if you have a torn ligament. But with this slight tweak, what we do is it's called functional MRIs. You can also infer brain functioning. So which areas of the brain are working the hardest at any particular time. And so what we've shown in all different sorts of settings, having people sort of do things where they don't have to move or imagining doing something where they're moving, is that one thing that happens even before you're in the stressful situation, maybe when you just know it's coming, or you were probably, before you got up to hit the first ball, I guarantee you were already stressed out, right? It didn't just happen when you were playing. And we show that neural areas that are involved in sort of our evolutionary ancient pain systems are active, sort of screaming alarm. And what that does is it shuts down the more evolved front area of your brain that is good at focusing on what you need to and not what you don't. And so you really derail the brain systems that are going to help you focus on the right things. You can see it in the brain.
So my limbic system, that middle part is firing, and the neocortex, the front part of the brain, has shut down completely?
No, it's disrupted, right? Nowhere, signaling to other areas that we're in distress, right? Sort of our neural pain signals, alarm signals. But it essentially, it derails or disrupts the ability of the frontal cortex to work as it should.
Something you said there was really interesting and resonated with me. You said it was likely that it wasn't that stress or anxiety encroached on you in that moment. It was possibly a build-up of things, and I'm possibly slightly paraphrasing you there, but that's very true to me, in as much as, if I go on my experience, my personal experience there, but also my experience as a sports psychologist working with players, is that human beings, players, performers, have a narrative going into a competition. I had a narrative. But my narrative was very much, I'm not good enough, I've got no chance of qualifying, this is going to be a disaster, which is great self-talk, by the way. But it's interesting, Sian, because I hear it with, say, soccer players, even at the very top level, is they when I've frequented medical departments at big soccer clubs here in England, you listen to them talk, and they have viewpoints and opinions and thoughts leading into a game that are often, we're playing this team, we never beat them, we've got no chance, or the pressure's on this week, or something like that. It feels like the moment they come to perform, the anxiety they're experiencing and everything that's happening neurologically actually starts, if it's on the Saturday, it starts on the Monday. It starts with that narrative. Would that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think it's so important. Like, what we do off the pitch or the green really matters. And we see this when we, in some of my work, we don't just study athletes, we study when people do all sorts of stressful things. And one thing we're really interested in is what happens when people are stressed out about doing math. and we have them do it. And so we can actually put people in a brain scanner and we just tell them, okay, you're going to do a math problem. So they haven't gotten a math problem. They just know it's going to come. And if you say you're going to do a math problem versus you're going to do a word problem, you can see for people who are scared of math, and we just say, hey, it's coming, these neural alarm signals go off, right? So nothing has happened yet. And I think that is really important in terms of the argument that there's this biological basis for worrying and being stressed and anxious that really plays out, and that we have to pay attention to that. It's not just our skill or ability in the moment. It's how we think, as you said, moving into it, and that affects how we think and play during the real situation.
So what I'm hearing from you there is a key intervention, a key shift could be to change the narrative, change the story. And before I get some comment from you there, I mean, I think it's really interesting. One of the best almost modern day case studies for this kind of stuff is actually the England soccer team and their propensity to lose penalty shootouts. And as an Englishman, I say that with a great deal of pain, I can assure you. But
especially against Germany.
Especially against Germany. But you see, this is the interesting thing is great work from Dr. Pippa Grange, the sports psych who was involved with England going into the last World Cup, and Gareth Southgate, the head coach, the manager. They really changed the narrative around penalties, because it was always, I think the narrative was very much, the story was very much, this is unfair, it's not a great way to, and we always lose these, to they worked on routines, pre-performance routines and stuff like that, but they very much changed the narrative to looking forward to these penalties, an opportunity to express one's skill. That shift of narrative, well, they had one penalty shootout in the last World Cup against Colombia, and they won it. So it's the same with your math problems versus word problems, isn't it? Change the narrative, shift the opportunity to deal with anxiety and subsequently compete.
Yeah, I mean, and how, I talk about it often is shifting our mindset, and it really matters in all sorts of ways. And so something you hit on I thought was really important, like that narrative, we also talk about it as self-talk. Like we tend to be really hard on ourselves when we talk to ourselves. Like the kinds of things we say to ourselves, we'd never say them to a friend when we're trying to get them hyped up or ready to go, or a family member. And I think being aware of that is really important. And I often talk a lot about being more compassionate with yourself, right? So giving yourself credit for what you can do and what you've done in the past. And I love this sort of changing it from this opportunity to lose something, to show your negativity, to this opportunity to approach something and get success, because we know that when you shift from this opportunity of losing to a mindset of approaching something, actually in your brain, systems kick in that allow you to better perform. So I think, it's a great way to think about it. And I often tell people you want to coach yourself like you're coaching someone else. And it's even sort of self-distancing. So there's psychological research showing that if you can distance yourself in how you talk, like instead of saying, I'm going to do this, Sian, you can do this for this reasons, and actually change how you're talking to yourself, it actually can improve performance.
You talk about in your TED talk, a bit I thought was really fascinating was, aside from those kind of psychological skills that I'd work on every day with athletes and what you've spoken about there, social support. Social support can be such an influence on our capacity to deal with our challenging, pressurized situations, if you like. What does that encompass, Sian? Is that parents? Is that coaches? Is it everybody? Is it the tasks coaches set competitors? Tell me a bit about environment and how that can interact with our ability to be able to deal with pressure.
Yeah, I think it goes back to this idea that it's not just about in the moment. You're not going to win by what you do in the moment or in the game. It's everything before, as you talked about, and it's everything around you, right? So if you have a perception that your team doesn't believe in you, that can trickle out into how you perform. If you have a perception that your coach isn't behind you, that can also affect your ability to perform. And so the dynamics of the team, the dynamics of the coach, even the parents, it all matters here, right? And so you can't control all of that, right? I mean, that is very true. So the key is, as an athlete or as, a coach, is to put your athletes in situations where they're getting the kind of environment they need moving into competition. preparation. And it's not just about right before. It's, maybe thinking a couple of days before, or even, what are they doing to find the benefits they need.
My last question on the choking area, and I don't know if this is unique to me. I don't think it is, but I always say to people, if you give me a golf club, and this is a very sad situation given I was a pro golfer, give me a golf club and put me in front of 10 people, and I'm pretty nervous. Hence why I'm now not a professional golfer. Put me in front of, well, let me illustrate it this way. Last year, I delivered a sports psychology presentation to 1,000 coaches in Poland. I wasn't speaking Polish, but I was translated. And my point being, I wasn't nervous at all. I enjoyed every single second of it. There just strikes me that pressure is so context specific, and I've always wondered about the interaction between pressure, confidence, self-belief, as in self-efficacy, skill set. Not really a question, Sian, but what's your thoughts on that? Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, well, I don't think people who are just learning a skill choke. Like, I don't think you have anything to choke with, right? So I often talk about choking being something that's really reserved as you get better at what you do. You don't have to be a professional athlete, and it doesn't even have to be an athletic skill. Like, I think a great choking incident doesn't happen in COVID times, but like imagine when you have like 30 seconds with someone you're trying to impress, right? And you can't figure out what to say, or, even when you're introducing yourself to someone, there's lots of ways to choke. But it is one of those unique things about pressure is that it's individualized. What we feel is a pressure situation. For one person, giving a talk in front of 1,000 people would be terrifying. And for another, giving a talk in front of one person, if that one person would say your mother or something, would be equally terrifying, right? So that's why, I think that's one of the reasons I think it's so interesting to watch sports in general. Like if we knew how everyone was going to play going into it, it wouldn't be so fantastic to watch, right? So it's this interaction, and the key is to figure out what are the triggers for you. And then it's about a toolbox of techniques, right? Because there's not a one size fits all. And in Choke, my book, I talk about that toolbox. And the idea is that you can pull from that toolbox, just like you pull from a toolbox in terms of how you train muscles or how you train for a game physically. You've got to pull from that toolbox psychologically as well.
Well, as you mentioned there, that was all taken from your book, Choke, What the Secrets of the Brain Reveal About Getting It Right When You Have to. That was your first book, and I'm a huge fan of that book, love it, and I'm also a huge fan of your second book, How the Body Knows Its Mind, the surprising power of the physical environment to influence how you think and feel. And this is an area that absolutely fascinates me as a sports psychology practitioner. The impact of the body on the mind, the link, the integration of body and mind. There's a funky term in psychology, embodied cognition, and this struck me as a book very much about embodied cognition. And I know you've written some research papers on this area. Could you tell us briefly and simply what embodied cognition is?
Yeah, I think a lot of what I wrote about in Choke is this idea that how we think can influence how we perform physically, right? And what I wanted the second book really to be about was the two-way street, right? So how our body moves, what environment we're in physically influences how we think. And I don't think we always recognize that bi-directionality. And that's really what embodied cognition is. It's this idea that what we're able to focus on, how we feel mentally, is driven in part by how our body is situated, whether that's how much we exercise, even how we're holding our body, whether we're in nature or not. All these things have an impact on our ability to think and feel and exist.
Well, this being a sports psych show, I think from a sports psychological perspective, how we hold our body influencing our mind is of real interest. I mean, at every chapter here, there's value for sports participants as well as coaches. But you start the book off with a really interesting chapter about the relationship between emotion and the body, and how if we change certain parts of our body, we can change our emotion. Specifically in this chapter about the relationship between our facial expression and depression. I thought it was just a fascinating chapter. Could you tell us a little bit about the link between emotion and the body?
Yeah, I mean, I think we often talk about our body and the signals it sends to other people. So like a coach might say, stand up straight when you walk out there. You want the other team to be intimidated or to know that you're confident, right? That matters. Or, if you're coming out of halftime and you guys are behind, how you run onto the field matters in terms of giving the other team some insight into what's going, that you're ready to go. But it turns out that all of those things affect you as well. And so there's really interesting research out there showing that, when people are smiling, holding a pencil between their teeth so they're smiling, kind of gritting it with their teeth, they think things are funnier or they than if they're frowning. And it sends signals. How we hold our face and our body sends signals essentially to our brain about how we should think and feel.
And obviously there's this notion of power posing, how we hold our body, how we there's certain poses that have been discovered to actually impact our mind, how we hold ourselves, how we move, how we act in the moment can make a difference. That's an area that's come across a little bit of controversy. What's your thoughts on power posing? And if I may ask, I don't know, but where do you stand on this notion of how I hold myself influences how I feel? It may influence me hormonally, such as release of testosterone, and then subsequent performance. What's your take on this at the moment?
Yeah, so I think there was a big push that this power pose idea could really affect our confidence and also maybe do that through changes in testosterone and other hormones, and then there's been a pushback that maybe some of this research is not as robust in terms of the connection between power posing and testosterone. So there's some findings that it has an effect and some it doesn't. But in my mind, look, if there's this link between power posing and confidence, that's an important link. And that's more proximal to where we want to go than anything else. So the mechanism figuring out is certainly important. But I think there's, even in the reviews that have questioned testosterone, there's been a clear link between the power posing and the confidence we feel. And so I tend to believe that how we hold ourselves does matter for how we feel and what we can do.
I think it's really interesting because I'm thinking of the subjective nature of how we feel, essentially. It's got to be quite difficult to test empirically in that respect, hasn't it? And if a single athlete says, well, if I hold myself on the start line of 100 meters in a certain way, and that helps empower me, it helps me feel great, helps me feel strong and ready. Whether one can test that scientifically is one thing, but if that person is saying, hey, if it helps me feel great, then why not?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of placebo effects. Like, it's okay with me if like someone feels better and then they perform better. Like, I know I'm 100% confident that how we feel affects how we perform. I mean, there's a lot of data that suggests that in all sorts of ways, right? How we talk to ourselves, whether we're having a positive or negative outlook, even how we interpret our physiological states. If you interpret your sweaty palms and a beating heart as a sign you're about to fall on your face, you're more likely to than if you interpret it as a sign you're excited and ready to go. How you feel matters for how you perform. And so I think the question is, for each individual athlete, how do they get to that state where they're able to think about what they're going to achieve rather than what they're going to lose?
Last couple of questions. A study, as I was reading the book, a study I found really, really interesting was from Miami University, not the Miami in Florida, but actually I'm not sure, where is Miami University? The one
It's
not in...
Miami of Ohio.
Oh,
Yeah.
Miami, Ohio. I apologise. And a research assistant in your lab at the time, Brian Sipot, who was
Yeah.
an ice hockey player,
Yeah.
one of the star defensemen. Interesting conversation I think you had with him that started a research paper on the experience that players have watching a game is different to the experience maybe that fans have watching the game. Can you tell us a little bit about that research paper? Because again, it's the mind and the body interacting in terms of when it's watching its environment or dealing with its environment.
Yeah. So I think this is a really great example of this notion of embodied cognition and the idea that we have, areas of our brain, motor areas of our brain that are involved in execution and planning movements. And they're not just for planning movements, they're also, it turns out, for understanding movements. And if you're really good at performing a movement, they get even more involved. And so what Brian had talked about was this idea that when he listens or watches a hockey game, he feels like he's playing, right? And because of he's an expert at what he's doing. And we were able to bring in professional hockey players and hockey fans and people who didn't play any hockey at all. And we scanned their brains using MRI while they listened basically to a radio broadcast of a hockey game. And what we showed was that for players especially, to some extent for fans, rabid fans, but not as much, that when they just listened to the game, their brains looked in some sense like they were playing. They were using the motor areas of the brain to anticipate an action, to be able to look forward, and it really sort of underscored this idea that physical experience can beget learning. And we've used this and understanding, and we've used this in all sorts of situations. So we extended this a couple of years later to students in physics class and showed that having physical experience with abstract concepts like angular momentum led them, when they were taking a test on it, to activate these motor areas of the brain and be able to make better predictions. And so it's really exciting to think about how movement and even athletics can have an impact in the classroom in this way. And I think really important for how we think about how we learn and how we perform.
My final question, you dedicate a chapter on using your body to calm one's mind, and very much centre on mindfulness as a form of meditation. It's I don't know if saying it's a growing area in sport is correct. It's probably it's certainly grown exponentially over the last few years. Mindfulness, why should an athlete engage in mindfulness? How can mindfulness help him or her?
Yeah, I mean, again, it goes back to this idea that we have to practice not only the physical aspects of what we're doing, but the mental. We have to, and mindfulness meditation is one, and especially body-centered meditation is one way to help do that, right? Where you're learning how to be aware and get rid of thoughts and feelings. And it's a skill like anything else. Being able to be in the moment and focus on what we want and not on what we don't needs to be practiced. And that's, I think, part of what I'm underscoring there, that, and it comes down to something that I think, I always say that if anyone takes anything away from my work or my talks is that we have to think about practicing the mental, just like we practice the physical. And if we don't, we're going to be in trouble in those situations where we need to put our best foot forward when it matters.
It's about training attention?
I mean, sure. I mean, it's about training our ability to perform under those conditions where our attention is challenged.
Yeah. Interesting. Sian, thank you so much. I know that chat will tap the interest of our audience. I know many people who have purchased Choke and used it as a bit of a Bible in terms of helping performers compete under pressure. And that second book is How the Body Knows Its Mind. How can people get hold of your books? Just use your channel, and do you have social media where people can follow you?
Yeah, my books are on Amazon, or you can go to my name, sianbeilock.com. So that's a mouthful, but it's SIANBEILOCK. And then I am on Instagram as Pres Beilock and on Twitter as Sian Beilock.
And there's a fantastic TED Talk out there that everybody should watch.
Yes, and I have a TED Talk.
Hey, thank you so much for your time. That was really interesting.
Really great to be here.
Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show, and if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.